Galactus. We are the Galactus. Celebrate another one of birthday bash.
Comic Cat.
It's your birthday today. Take an ice cream, it's on its way. And
Comic Cat.
you're such a good boy this year. Open up your gifts while we all cheer.
This video talks about the whole Comic Cat series so far, assuming you've read the strip. So if you haven't read Comic Cat, please visit tadigus.com/comics and read them so you understand anything I'm talking about in this video. Also, you don't want spoilers if you haven't read it, so yeah, please go do that. When I started Comic Cat a year ago, I just did it kind of out of nowhere. I just thought, you know what, this will be fun to do again. I didn't think anyone was really gonna read it or care about it, and honestly, if no one read it, I might not have even gone this long doing it. So thank you, all of you, so much for reading my stupid comic strip every Thursday. Buddy, you're gonna have to move. I got a thing I gotta do here. Come here. Come on. Alright. Thank you. As some of you might know, I've been doing Comic Cat since about 2006. Since I was like 8 years old. I kept it going for a long time, and then I took a couple years off, and then last year I decided that I wanted to do a new version of Comic Cat, make something actually quality, not made by an 8-year-old, and actually put it out there for people to read. It was difficult deciding what to do exactly, because when you have a comic strip that you've been doing since you were a kid and it's bad, do you completely start from scratch, or do you take elements from it to make something sort of new? Anyway, I wanted to do something special for the year anniversary of this. So today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the old Comic Cat and see the changes that I made, how I adapted certain things. And yeah, let's jump right in. So what you're looking at here is the first real drawing of Comic Cat, Dog, Ham, and Joey. This was drawn in 2006. This was the cover to the first book that I did, and I actually did the cover before I did any of the strips. So this is really where they started, aside from a couple earlier designs. We don't like to talk about those. Just talking from a design perspective, they've gone through a lot of changes, as you can see. They were like a lot lankier and weirder. I kind of went with more of a squishy, compact look. I don't know if squishy is the word I'm looking for. We're gonna go with squishy though. What you're looking at here is the very first strip in the Comic Cat series. So it starts out, Comic is with his owner, Joey, who has gotten him a new friend, which is Dog the dog, and he doesn't want that. That was kind of the premise of old Comic Cat. It was Comic with his owner being a cat, and then Dog being a dog, and them being friends, but not really. Like I said, this was made by an 8-year-old. So when it came to deciding what to do for new Comic Cat, this isn't a premise that really works. This was inspired by Garfield. It's basically just worse Garfield, which I wasn't gonna do, obviously. So in the new one, you know, they're not really pets. They're essentially people, just animals, but they live like people, and there's no humans except for one for no reason. Whatever. The premise was changed entirely. It's kind of just them just doing their thing instead of being cats and dogs, and the whole like series revolving around jokes about cats and dogs. I mean, Joey was changed entirely. I mean, there was no use for an owner character, and also I'm bad at drawing humans, so he's just a robot now. So that's sort of the premise of old Comic Cat. That's as deep as it goes. But now let's start diving more into specific characters and sort of specific storylines in Comic Cat. Figure out how... I explained it already. I don't have to re-explain this to you. So I think Comic Cat himself is the character who's changed the least. Back in old Comic Cat, he was still that grumpy hates everything sarcastic guy, and I don't know, that hasn't really changed. As you can see, Dog, from a character design perspective, has also changed quite a bit. He used to just have like the droopy ears, which I still do now, but I kind of have them perking up a lot more because that looks better. But as an actual character, Dog was always just kind of the dumb, happy character, which isn't that interesting of a character, which is why he hasn't had a whole lot to do in the series so far. So when it came to doing Season 3, I knew I wanted to do something more interesting with Dog. And I'll get into this more in my Season 3 self-reflection video, which will be out in a couple weeks when Season 3 finishes up. But I knew I wanted to do something more interesting with Dog, so I decided to look back at some old storylines. Even in old Comic Cat, Dog typically didn't have a whole lot to do. The one real storyline that I remember doing with him was this time, it was about 2009 or so. Dog blew up the refrigerator with dynamite, you know, as one does. And he had to go to obedience school. Since they're not, like, pets anymore, I obviously couldn't translate the story one for one. And I wouldn't want to because it's awful and was written by, was that like 10 or 11? Like 11. I don't know. But anyway, I went with college because that's a little more in line with what modern Comic Cat is. You know, you had to translate it to like a real storyline, not, oh, it's Garfield, but not good. While we haven't really seen a whole lot from Dog's college life, one thing I can briefly touch on is his classmate Wilbert, who appeared in a Season 3 strip, was actually one of his classmates and best friends from old Comic Cat. They met in obedience school. I don't remember what Wilbert did to get there. I'll have to look that up later. But yeah, in old Comic Cat, around 2009 too, he was only around for like a year or two in the strips, but he was sort of Dog's best friend like around that time. He appeared in a lot of the college, or the obedience school strips, I guess they were then, and his character was sort of just the smart genius guy, which isn't really interesting, so I kind of just changed that completely and got rid of that and just kept the character design. But yeah. As you can see, Ham's design has changed very drastically. He was originally a tiny circle with tiny little circle arms, and eventually he became a slightly bigger circle, and now he looks more like an actual hamster. So this here is the first strip with Ham the hamster. He was given to Comic for his birthday, so I guess canonically Comic owns Ham. So that gets into all kinds of weird alternate timelines, but whatever. Similar to Wilbert, Ham was also kind of a genius inventor character. I don't know why I liked that stereotype so much, but I went with that multiple times and it was awful. He often had a jetpack in the older strips that he invented, I think. I just thought jetpacks were cool then, okay? Don't judge me. When it came to New Comic Cat, I decided to scrap that entirely because it didn't really do anything at all. I always liked the other half of Ham's character better, which was he's small and timid, and I leaned more into that side of old Ham instead of the weird genius inventor. Why did I do that? While you only see it very briefly, Ham's jetpack does appear in Season 2. He borrowed it from Fish. I thought that would just be, you know, a fun little inside joke to myself, because no one else knows about this. Even if a lot of these dumb little details were just for me, I always thought it was fun to take tiny little elements of old Comic Cat that didn't work and just make tiny little references to them. It's fan service purely for me and me alone. While we're on the topic of Ham, let's talk about this character, the squirrel, who doesn't have a name, but appears sometimes in Season 3 strips. In old Comic Cat, this character was originally named Joe, and was Ham's best friend. He lived next door in a tree, and he was sort of the wild, crazy friend character, which has been kind of completely dropped. Now he's just a guy. I felt like the sort of sidekick to Ham character wasn't really needed anymore, because, you know, there's so many other characters for Ham to bounce off of now. He's got Comic, Dog, Red. I didn't feel like Joe was really... I didn't feel like he was really needed anymore, so I didn't use him for a while. And then in Season 3, I just decided to start using him as sort of this reoccurring extra character who's just there if I need something, but there's not a better character to fill that role. Joe was later renamed to Acorn because there was already a character named Joey, and it felt weird to have a Joe and then a Joey, so I went with Acorn, and that's what we're going with now. That is his canonical name. Sorry, Joe. And also, in a Season 3 strip, as you can see here, you can see his house very briefly. It's still the big tree near Comic's house. Around 2009 or so, Acorn also got a car, which went on to be one of his most defining character traits, is owns car. Yikes. As you can see on the top there, Acorn's car mine written on the side. I don't know. So the car was, because I can't draw cars, so I just made it look like an acorn sort of shape with big wheels. And as you can see in the bottom panel, this is from a season 3. This is from a Season 3 strip on the bottom panel there. I used a cutout of a later version of Ham's car, or Acorn's car. I didn't get a lot of sleep last night, okay, don't judge me. Yeah, Acorn's car went through a lot of redesigns. It hasn't, aside from like this joke cutout of an old drawing, it has not reappeared in New Comic Cat, but that might be subject to change. We'll see. Acorn was also a fish agent, very briefly, in about 2009. A lot of this I'm saying started around 2009. From 2009 to like 2012 was like my most creative era in Comic Cat, so a lot of the stuff was drawn from those years specifically. Anyway, Acorn was very briefly a fish agent. I think it was only for like a strip or two, and then he got fired. But as you can see, it is referenced in Season 3, where he is now a janitor for fish, rather than being an agent. That just seemed to suit his background extra character in the new series a little more. I also want to briefly bring up that in the old Comic Cat, once Chewie came around, there wasn't as much for Acorn to do as Ham's sidekick, which I said was a problem in modern Comic Cat now. So there was a little bit where I didn't really know what to do with him, so I made him good friends with Snelly eventually, because Snelly didn't have a whole lot to do after her introduction, and then Acorn was kind of irrelevant, so I just figured they're friends now. Anyway, there is a reference to that in modern Comic Cat where Acorn's first strip that he's introduced in is a Snelly strip. That is the first character we see him interact with. It feels weird that I have so much more to say about these weird little side characters than the actual main characters of the series. It's just that though the main characters were a little more one-for-one, the side characters, there's so much weird stuff to talk about. Alright, let's talk about Chewie, Ham's little brother, who the joke is that he's bigger, haha. This was the first strip with Chewie, actually one of the first Comic Cats ever made. The joke of this original strip was Comic is chasing Dog, or Dog is running from Comic's older brother because he's bigger than Dog, and then Dog calls his dad to chase them off because he's bigger, and then Ham's baby brother is massive. That's the joke. And then Chewie didn't appear for like 2 or 3 years after this. He was always intended to be just a one-off character. I didn't really have any ideas for him. And I mean, as you can see, Dog's dad and Comic's brother, actually Comic's brother did come back a few years later in the old strips, but Dog's dad never came back, and neither of them are in New Comic Cat. But Chewie, weirdly enough, went from being this one-time joke to being one of the biggest characters in the series, both old Comic Cat and new. In 2009, Chewie was reintroduced into the series. I don't even really remember why. I just thought, hey, that was funny, let's do that again. But Chewie came back. and he was completely redesigned. He was made a little smaller so he can fit in the same panel as the rest of the characters. He was given a giant buck tooth, goofier eyes. He was a lot less evil and scary looking. The old Comet Cat, his large size was originally explained by he ate a radioactive cookie. Yeah. Even though Chewie was one of the biggest and most important characters in Old Comet Cat, looking back, he is one of my least favorites. Now, around that time, I mean, if you go back and see what the internet memes were like in about 2009, it was... Chewie really embraces and is kind of the embodiment of that 2007 to 2012 haha random. It's awful. I don't have anything else to add. It's awful. And Chewie was kind of just that as a character, which, you know, as a dumb kid, he was my favorite character to work with. He was in almost every strip eventually. But man, looking back, you know, in like the early 2009, Chewie wasn't too bad because he wasn't in every strip, but eventually it kept getting worse and worse, and then eventually we had strips like this where the joke is me want in, and then he explodes Comet Cat's house, and that's the end. He also talked in this terrible voice. I mean, read this. Me as president, me winned by landslide. Yeah. That was one of the first things to go when making new Chewie, was to get rid of how he talks, cause no. Also, I just want to point out, I found this. Happy 4th year of Comet Cat, everybody. Woo. When it came to starting from scratch, basically, with Chewie, I decided to make him more of just a kid, because there's a lot more potential there than what's gonna be dated and horrible in a couple years, and is already horrible, like, as you're making it, but you don't know for a few years, because you're a dumb child. Yeah, Chewie was easier to rewrite, because I knew immediately what the problems were with his character. Although, I guess, technically, in the Season 2 spoilers, by the way, they grabbed Chewie out of the old timeline because he wasn't in the new timeline. So technically this is the same Chewie, just older and can talk now, and is slightly less destructive. There is actually one Season 3 strip which calls back to the older Chewie a bit. In Old Comet Cat, we had this. This was Chewie's superhero alter ego, Super Me-self. And yes, he is wearing a pair of underwear on his giant tooth, because I was a dumb kid. We actually see Super Me-self return in a Season 3 strip as Chewie's Halloween costume. I thought that would be just a fun little throwback, once again, to myself and no one else. We also see a little bit of that old destructive side of Chewie as he destroys Acorn's Christmas decorations. I think a little bit of that classic is good in small doses, but when that becomes the entire character, that is where the problem arose. Believe it or not, Comet Cat is actually an old character too, because a new me is just not creative and it just wants to recycle stuff made by a 6-year-old. Comet Cat was made in about 2010, originally spelled Comet, now spelled Comet because, I don't know, old Tad couldn't spell, I guess. In Old Comet Cat, he was a superhero who just happened to look like Comet Cat. There was no real relation there. The major storyline with Comet he was only in like a year worth of strip, like not even, he wasn't around for very long though. Anyway, the little mini storyline with him is that he was the big new superhero and it was super popular and everyone wanted to be his sidekicks and no one wanted to be a Fish member anymore. So Rocky and the rest of Fish hated Comet Cat and made an anti-superhero league. Anyway, that was honestly kind of one of the more fleshed out storylines in Old Comet Cat. But I decided to change that up a bit. I wanted to keep the Fish aspect, but I instead made him a clone of Comet Cat made by Fish, who's being hunted by Fish now. And that's where he gets his superhero disguise, is he's trying to hide from them. I thought making him a clone of Comic Cat, who's just depressed and miserable like Comic Cat, was a better fit for what the series is now. Now, some stuff could technically work still as just updated, but I think to match what is already done of the modern Comic Cat, some stuff had to be changed up quite a bit. And in old Comic Cat, it was only for like a strip or two, but Snelly was briefly his sidekick. And so in new Comic Cat, I decided to make them friends just because that was a good little dynamic, even though it was short-lived in old Comic Cat. But now I like the new relationship between the characters, even though they're completely different from what they were. While we're on the topic of Snelly, let's talk about Snelly. Wow, what a transition. Snelly is one of the most different, or one of the more changed characters, aside from one, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Her original character she was the environmentalist skunk, and was trying to teach everyone how to be environmental, and yeah, that was completely scrapped. The one thing that I kind of kept was that she was kind of obnoxious, and that was like the basis of her new character. Is in the new one, she's just a scam artist, pretty much. I knew to make her character actually likable, I had to make a lot of changes, because just being there to tell Ham that jetpacks are bad for the environment, like, that's not fun. Another fun piece of trivia is that her pet flower, shown in a Season 3 strip, 2 Season 3 strips actually, was actually one of the first Comic Cat characters and was introduced years and years before Snelly was even conceptualized. This is the first strip with the flower. The flower is going to eat Comic Cat. It is giant because Comic Cat overwatered it. The flower actually appeared in a few strips after that, before Snelly was introduced. But the design that we see for the flower in modern Comic Cat is based off of this strip here. Eventually the flower was shrunk down and put in a potted plant so that it could move with them. The whole cast, their house was destroyed. I think that either by Chewie or tornado. Their house was destroyed a few times and they had to move. But yeah, the flower was shrunk down, and that is what the current design is based off of. While we're here on this strip, let's just talk about one of the weirdest jokes in the series so far, and that is this strip about Leg Grow, which is a product sold by Snelly. This was a product that was in a lot of old Comic Cats. It was just Leg Grow in a can. I don't know where this came from, but it was in a lot of old strips. I just thought it would be a fun little gag to bring back. But yeah, I wish I remembered why I thought this was anything. Why did I do this? The pig villain from Season 2, believe it or not, he's an old character. There was a group of evil pigs who fought fish a couple of times. And I got rid of the team of pigs. I felt like one evil pig was enough, you know? And I changed his design up a lot to make him a lot more distinct and creepy and weird. And he's actually one of my favorite designs in modern Comic Cat. I'm really happy with how he was changed up. Yes, even the tree strip from Season 3, that was almost exactly, I mean, it was changed up a lot to make it like work. But like the rough outline of the strip and the joke is from old Comic Cat, one of the first comics actually in the series, which is crazy. In the original, he was hiding behind the tree, as he does in the new one. He's gonna scare Dog, and then, you know, they're arguing, he kicks the tree. I basically just made it make more sense and be slightly funnier, and also I made it sort of fit in with the storyline of Season 3. Also designed the tree to make him not look like Wispy Woods from Kirby quite as much. A lot of my old characters were based off of Kirby. I don't know why. Ricky the Raccoon, one of the favorite new characters from Season 3, was originally very, 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 very different. In the old Comic Cat, this was once again around 2009, 2010. He was introduced as a Roman raccoon who was a gladiator and was hit so hard in the arena that he was knocked to modern day Comic Cat. Which honestly isn't that bad, but I didn't want to do that again. His character was kind of completely changed. He's just this crazy raccoon who lives in the trash behind Comic Cat's house. Yeah. Although his classic armor was actually referenced in a recent Season 3 Comic Cat strip. Obviously, like, he wasn't gonna wear that helmet in the whole series again. That was a nightmare to draw before. Also, his design was just awful before. I'm very happy with his new design. It's one of my favorites. Before, it was just awful. Anyway, yeah, the armor from his old design was in a Season 3 strip where they're playing Pimcha, which I guess I should talk about Pimcha here. Pimcha wasn't just a word that I made up for this strip. Pimcha was another old, failed comic series. I don't think that one even got started. It was a fantasy adventure series. I don't want to talk about that right now. I'm not ready to talk about Pimcha. This is enough. Next up, we have Taco the Turtle, who's honestly a pretty minor character in modern Comic Cat. And it was kind of the same way in old Comic Cat too. He was always around and was one of the main, like, house characters, but he wasn't really used a whole lot, and he was honestly only in, like, a strip every now and then, or was in the background of a group strip. Anyway, here is his first appearance. As you can see, Doug says here and gives him a turtle, and then Comic Cat screams. And that was the joke of the old strip. And Taco has been a mainstay ever since. Even though he didn't have a whole lot to do, he did occasionally have a storyline from time to time. One of the more important ones being this here. When Fish was introduced, Rocky was originally introduced before the rest of Fish as Taco's tank mate. Taco lived underwater in a fish tank. I don't think I knew how turtles worked. I'll talk a little more about this in just a minute when we get to Fish. But yeah, that was like one of the bigger Taco things. This is one of the few times he had something to do. There is a bit of a continuity error. I found this was made a few years later, like after the last one I showed. This was like 2011 or something. So Taco was sort of reintroduced. I don't know. I don't remember the exact context of this strip, but this explanation is that Ham and Acorn, those are their names, they went to a taco place and they were out of toys for the kids' meals. So they gave them a turtle, and his name is Taco because he came from a taco place. And that's all there is to say about Taco for now. One of the more controversial things from new Comic Cat is actually one of the more interesting topics to talk about for old Comic Cat, and I saved this one for last. So let's talk about Fish. This was, I believe, the first appearance of Rocky. He was, as I said, a goldfish who lived with Taco in the fish tank. He was introduced before the rest of the group. He was just kind of he wasn't gonna have a group at first. He was just kind of a character on his own. I later decided it would be funny. It'd be funny if he had a group. His old design was pretty unfortunate. Obviously, he had to be redesigned. That was not gonna cut it. You can also see the first appearance of Agent Iguana, who is just Iguana and has never really had a real name. But we can see how they were redesigned here. Rocky lost his classic bandana because I couldn't really figure out how to make that work on a fish. I don't know. I made him a little more fish-like, and I just couldn't get it to work. He did get glasses later on, around like 2011, and I did keep the glasses because those seemed to suit him. Agent Iguana originally was sort of the funny, wacky member of Fish, and he hasn't had a whole lot to do in the new strips, but we can kind of see that with his happy face, with his tongue sticking out as he's shooting a giant death ray in the new strip. You know, a lot of people have been asking, like, why isn't Ham the hamster, you know, Agent H in Fish, you know? A lot of people have been speculating that maybe, like, he's going to become Agent H, and originally, that was the plan. He was the first fourth member of Fish when they were originally introduced. It didn't stick around for long, only a couple months of the comics, and I think he was fired the same strip as Acorn. It's also worth noting that S was originally for Snail rather than Spider. We'll get to that later and show the transition. One of my favorite elements of Old Comic Cat was Fish. They just seemed endlessly creative with what you could do with them. I mean, there was one here where they had giant robots, and that was the whole strip, was just them goofing around in giant robots. I feel like that was where I went wrong with introducing them into modern Comic Cat a bit. When in season 2, they were based more off of like the 2013, 2014 Fish. I know that means a lot to all of you. I'll have to dig up the Fish miniseries at some point, and we'll talk about that. Not today. This is a lot already. So with season 3, I'll get to this a little more in my season 3 self-reflection. But I went back to this sort of old classic Fish, but modernizing that, obviously, where it's just kind of, they're silly and goofy and they're terrible at what they do. I wanted more of that, because that was originally why Fish was so much fun to work with. It's also worth noting that the comic with the giant robots was also where Agent Spider was first introduced, originally introduced in the giant robot suit instead of the actual spider itself, but whatever. Old Fish had a lot more just random members as well. They had like letters of like the whole alphabet, but only the ones that spelled out Fish were the main agents. So there were some extras. There was a panda and a penguin, and I think there was some other kind of like a gecko or something. So Spider wasn't originally Agent S, even when first introduced, was just a random agent. This is getting back to the Comic Cat storyline that I mentioned earlier, and also the last appearance of Agent Snail. It left because his parents wanted him to go be productive and join the Comic Cat sidekick agency instead of Fish. This is also the strip where Agent Spider officially becomes Agent S. Hot dog. Here's a sort of side-by-side comparison of the old Fish building and the new one. So Fish was always one of those sort of larger-than-life things that in my head, it was amazing, but I couldn't draw it because I was a terrible artist. And so I usually just represented it with this abandoned warehouse, as you can see in the top there. But there was a lot more to it, and eventually it was practically a city. With the new Comic Cat, New Fish, I decided to go a little back to the original, where it's just this warehouse in the middle of nowhere. There's a little more detail to it. The Secret Fish HQ free Wi-Fi, getting back to that silly, fun side of Fish. Yeah. And yeah, you know, that's all I really have to talk about today. There's so much more old Comic Cat stuff, but there's a lot of stuff that I haven't gotten to adapting yet, so I figured I'd just do most of the stuff that I've already done in these first 3 seasons. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, and here's to another year of Comic Cat. Thank you all for watching and reading. Hey everybody, thank you for watching. I just want to give a quick shout out to Decade Decaf Cade, who did a really good top 10 Comic Cat strips video. There should be a link on the screen. If YouTube breaks and there's not, there's a link in the description. Please go check that out. Anyway, that's it. I promise it's ending now. See you in the next video, and thank you for watching.